So we all know about Japan, right? The country that has captured the imagination of the world. The land of breathtaking beauty, of a culture both timeless and futuristic, with neon-lit cities that never sleep and with sacred sites full of history and culture. From the precision of its craftsmanship to the beauty of its calligraphy, to the innovation that has reshaped the modern world, to its pop culture that has taken over the modern media, Japan is truly unlike anywhere else on earth. But hidden beneath the neon-lit streets, beyond the dazzling lights of Tokyo, buried deep within its rich history and ancient traditions, is a story that many have possibly never heard of. A story of faith. A faith that was so strong and so beautiful that it was hunted, crushed, and driven underground, and yet somehow it refused to die. Hidden within the rich and beautiful history of Japan is a story about a man who crossed oceans to bring the name of Jesus Christ to its shores, and a people who clung to that faith and clung to that name through the most horrific of trials and tribulations. This is the amazing story of how Christianity came and survived in Japan. Something that's important to understand is that before Christianity ever came to Japan, the country was already deeply spiritual. The Japanese practiced a blending of something called Shintoism and Buddhism. Religion was not separated from daily life. It shaped their customs, their ceremonies, their understanding of nature, honor, death, and the world itself. Their spirituality was deeply intertwined into their everyday lives, and it impacted how they did everything. Christianity would arrive in Japan around the mid-1500s, and during this time, Japan was not a peaceful place at all. It was during a period called the Sengoku Jidai, the Age of Warring States. This was a time where rival warlords and samurai clans fought constantly for land and power. Villages were burned, families were uprooted, violence, instability, and suffering touched nearly every part of society. Peace was fragile and often brief. Life was marked by suffering, fear, loss, and instability. This is important to understand because Christianity was not entering a land of ignorant people searching for easy answers. Japan already had ancient traditions, it already had spirituality, and it already had its own understanding of suffering, honor, and meaning. And if Christianity were to be brought to Japan, it meant that it would confront deeply rooted traditions, centuries of belief, and a culture that already had its own answers. So if someone were to even attempt to bring Christianity to this country, it would require someone who not only had zeal and passion, but incredible intelligence. It would require someone who was capable of understanding the Japanese people, their culture, and the way they saw the world. But where in the world would you even find such a person? So this is where I'm going to take you into the life of the person who would one day bring Christianity to Japan, the life of someone named St. Francis Xavier. So let's travel to the other side of the world to the Kingdom of Navarre. Here we enter the life of the young boy who would one day bring Christianity to Japan, Francis Xavier. Francis never wanted to be a missionary. He never cared about God, nor ever thought about serving God in any way at all. From birth, Francis was part of the noble, wealthy, and successful Xavier household. His father was a respected counselor to the King of Navarre, and his mother came from a noble family. His family highly valued learning, so from as early as he could remember, he received a rigorous education. Through all this, Francis developed enormous ambitions of becoming a famous and successful academic, and he was on the right path. He was highly intelligent, a master at critical and logical reasoning, and an expert problem solver. He had all the makings of greatness, but the problem was he had absolutely zero intentions for using his gifts and potential to serve God. So how did God transform this ambitious young man into a missionary? Well, you see, God sent another man Francis's way, a man named Ignatius of Loyola. It all happened in the University of Paris. At the time Francis was studying there, fully focused on achieving his dream of becoming a successful academic. Ignatius had also arrived at the university, but unlike Francis, Ignatius wasn't there to build a career or pursue any worldly success at all. He came because God was leading him there. You see, Ignatius had once been very similar to Francis. As a young man, Ignatius was a soldier who was incredibly ambitious with dreams of glory and honor, but one day he took a cannonball to the leg and was left bedridden for months. His dreams were absolutely crushed, but during his long recovery he began reading scripture along with books of the lives of the saints and the Christian martyrs. Slowly his heart began to change, and after recovering, he left behind his former life and dedicated himself completely to God. So now we return to the University of Paris, where we have two very different men, both walking down completely different paths, and God wanted these two men to meet. So Ignatius came to share a dorm room with Francis and entered Francis' circles of friends. At first, Francis found Ignatius irritating. Ignatius constantly spoke about God, about holiness, and the salvation of souls, and on top of this, Ignatius would constantly challenge Francis regarding his ambitions. It was almost like Ignatius was insulting his ambition, calling it meaningless. Ignatius specifically challenged him with the gospel, and one Bible verse that Ignatius repeated to Francis was this: "For what doth it profit a man if he gain the whole world and suffer the loss of his own soul?" Those words stayed with Francis and echoed in his heart. Ignatius continued to keep Francis and his friends company for the next 3 years, and over the years, Ignatius's prayers and words started opening Francis's heart. He started to look at Ignatius. The man that he once found irritating became the man that he most admired. In Ignatius, Francis saw true peace, joy, and confidence in God, something that he didn't have. He wanted to have what Ignatius had, so eventually, Francis surrendered his life completely to Christ. So in 1534, Francis joined Ignatius and several of their companions at a small chapel in Paris. There, they made vows of poverty, chastity, and they dedicated their lives completely to Christ. The new brotherhood continued studying together, and years later, Ignatius and Francis were ordained as priests together. The two friends who had once argued in the halls of Paris now stood united at the altar, devoted to bringing souls to Christ. A few more years went by as these two men grew in friendship and holiness, and then one day, an unexpected opportunity arose. The King of Portugal had requested missionaries to travel to India to minister to Portuguese settlers and to spread the gospel throughout the region. Francis heard of the opportunity but thought he would stay behind. Over the past few years, his heart had changed, but he didn't think he would be a good missionary. But at the very last moment, the man who was meant to go on the missionary journey became seriously ill. So all of a sudden, the mission fell to Francis Xavier. And surprisingly, despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, and despite the potential danger ahead, Francis accepted the mission. So in 1541, Francis Xavier set sail on his first great missionary journey. Francis didn't know it yet, but the next few years, God was going to form him into an amazing missionary. So Francis spent the next couple of years in India. He threw himself completely into the work. He spent nearly every waking hour serving others. He preached on the streets, he taught children the Christian faith, he cared for the sick, he visited prisoners, and he baptized new converts. And he did all of this with incredible energy. Wherever Francis went, people were moved by his compassion, his humility, and his sincerity, and the results were extraordinary. Entire villages converted to Christianity. Churches began to grow throughout the region. Thousands and thousands and thousands were baptized. The mission was a massive success. God had truly made a great missionary out of Francis. But his mission wasn't over. It was during this time in India that Francis encountered a man from a distant land. That man was named Angelo. So you see, Angelo had fled his homeland after a violent conflict and encountered the Portuguese and converted to Christianity. Angelo spoke to Francis and told him about his homeland. He described the people deeply shaped by honor, discipline, and love of learning. He spoke of a society that valued debate and careful judgment, and that did not accept ideas lightly but examined them with seriousness before embracing them. He described the people who were living through great conflict, oppression, and war, and a people who suffered greatly, but through their suffering seeked out truth with zeal. The land that Angelo was speaking of was Japan. These words left a deep impression on Francis. He listened intently as Angelo spoke on and on about stories of his homeland, about his people, and the Holy Spirit stirred Francis' heart. Francis knew that God was telling him to carry his mission forward to Japan. It all made sense. Francis' upbringing, his studies, his intellect, his massive successes in his missionary work in India, all the suffering, trial, and learning all these years. It was like everything that he had been through was to prepare him for Japan, because what waited for him there would be unlike anything he had ever experienced. So after a long period of prayer and discernment, Francis knew that God was leading him to Japan. And so, in 1549, Francis Xavier and Angelo set sail from India to Japan. So now we come back to the heart of the story. Francis, the man who started out as an ambitious academic, went through a conversion and gave his life to Christ, unexpectedly went out on a missionary in India, had one of the most successful missionary campaigns in church history, and now is again departing on the next stage of his journey in Japan. Once again, the voyage was difficult, it was exhausting, filled with storms, sickness, and uncertainty, but finally, after months of travel, Francis Xavier arrived in Japan in 1549, landing at Kagoshima. He came full of hope, zeal, and a burning desire to preach the gospel, and after the success he had seen in India, Francis had high hopes for the people in Japan. He felt as though everything he had experienced up to that point led him to this moment. But as he entered the villages and the towns and began encountering the Japanese people, he quickly realized something was different. He was not welcomed in the same way he had been in parts of India. Many people avoided him, some were cautious of him, and in certain places, him and his companions were turned away. Even with Anjiro by his side, very few people were willing to openly speak with him at first, so Francis spent time observing. Just as Anjiro had described, the Japanese people were deeply spiritual. Francis saw them praying at the temples and within their homes. He watched them carefully honor their religious traditions, and he admired their discipline, honor, and dignity with which they carried themselves. He encountered a culture unlike anything he had ever seen before. It was beautiful, it was refined, and deeply rooted in tradition. At the same time, he also witnessed the violence and the instability of feudal Japan. He saw the conflicts between rival warlords and the samurai clans and the people who suffered greatly because of these wars. Francis understood something very quickly. This mission would be absolutely nothing like India. The Japanese were incredibly cautious of outsiders, and they did not easily place their trust in strangers. Whenever Francis tried to get a word and people questioned him, they said, "Who are you? Who sent you? And why should we even listen to you?" And they would chase him away. For the first time in years, Francis Xavier felt stuck. He knew that if he was going to reach the people of Japan, he would have to begin again from the ground up. In India, many people had listened to him immediately. Entire communities had come forward for baptism in India. But Japan was different. The people there did not accept new ideas simply because someone preached to them with passion. They wanted answers. So he adapted. Instead of trying to speak immediately to large crowds, he began studying the culture more carefully. He changed the way he dressed, and the way he spoke, and the way he carried himself. Prior to this, he dressed kind of humbly, but this time he knew that he had to present himself not merely as a wandering preacher, but as a representative of great and learned tradition. It was through his noble background, all the training and all the education that he had received when he was younger, that would prove to be his greatest strength here in Japan. He then sought meetings not only with common villagers, but with local rulers and educated leaders, and he demonstrated his great intellect, his great knowledge, and his respect and admiration for their culture. He showed the Japanese people how much he understood about their culture and how much he appreciated their culture. And then he presented Christianity to them, not as superstition but as truth and something worthy of serious thought. He carried himself with authority and nobility. Public debates were actually quite common in Japan, especially among educated religious leaders. Shinto Buddhist monks were highly trained, highly educated, disciplined, and very skilled in argument. They were not easily impressed by foreigners, but Francis came to speak with these monks. He held his ground remarkably well. All that time he spent at the university studying philosophy and theology had trained him to think carefully, argue logically, and defend his ideas clearly. Now in Japan, for the first time in years, those skills became essential to his mission. He debated questions about God, morality, creation, and the human soul. He argued that there must be one eternal creator behind all things. He explained that truth could not contradict reason. He preached that salvation was not found through human effort alone, but through Jesus Christ. Sometimes the discussions lasted for hours, or over the course of a few days, or over a course of a month, and people watched in awe. Not everyone agreed with him. Some monks rejected him completely, and others just outright mocked him. But even those that disagreed often respected Francis because he was willing to answer difficult questions directly instead of avoiding them. And slowly, his reputation began to spread throughout Japan. People started hearing about the foreign missionary who could debate scholars and who spoke confidently about religion and philosophy. So curious listeners all began to gather simply just to hear the discussions. This was not the same rapid success we had seen before in India. It was slow, difficult, and uncertain. He wasn't preaching directly to crowds anymore, and he wasn't baptizing thousands at once, but he was presenting truth. In India, Francis had seen entire villages come forward for baptism almost all at once. But here in Japan, it was completely different. Here, nobody really converted quickly. The Japanese wanted time. They observed him carefully, they listened quietly, and they questioned everything. For weeks, sometimes months, Francis would speak and debate with people who initially showed interest, but eventually in the end just walked away unconvinced. But slowly, over time, something beautiful and something miraculous began to happen. A local man would continue returning with questions. A scholar would become even more curious about Christian teaching. A small family would quietly ask Francis to learn more, and Francis explained the basics of Christianity carefully. He would teach curious individuals in small groups. Sometimes it was only a handful of listeners gathered inside a small home, but Francis did not despise these small beginnings, because slowly, those small groups began turning into tiny Christian communities. Yes, the conversions came slowly, it was one soul at a time, but because becoming Christian in Japan could bring shame, suspicion, or rejection from others, these converts often wrestled with the faith privately before making a decision. They wanted to understand what they believed in and why they believed it, and once convinced, they really held on to the faith seriously. So, Francis began spending long hours teaching small groups of converts. The first seeds of Christianity were beginning to take root, and the more Francis learned about the Japanese people, the more hopeful he became. So, after more than 2 years in Japan, more than 2 years of endless debating, endless teaching, and endless prayer, Francis Xavier looked back on the mission. It had not been easy, but he recognized that the seeds of faith had been planted, and the gospel had taken root, but he knew that the mission would require more. There were only about 2,000 Japanese converts by that time. He knew this was only the beginning. So in 1551, Francis Xavier left Japan and returned back to India to prepare more missionaries to come to Japan. So you remember those companions who once stood beside Francis and Ignatius in that small chapel in Paris? So what actually happened while Francis was out on missionary for the last 10 years, Ignatius was busy in Paris. That group of men had now become known as the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, founded by Ignatius. And now, these Jesuits were growing and becoming one of the greatest missionary forces in the world. And in India was one of the centers for the Jesuits who were dispatched throughout Asia. So Francis met with these new Jesuit missionaries. He gathered with them and he told them everything he had witnessed in Japan. He spoke of the Japanese people with admiration and excitement, and he described their intelligence, their discipline, their love of learning, their seriousness in matters of religion and philosophy. He told them about the hardships they endured and how difficult it was to preach to them. But although the mission there was still small, he had seen the Japanese people were willing to engage seriously with Christianity, and those who embraced the faith did not do so lightly. He told these missionaries that the seeds had been planted, so they did not waste any time. So Francis began teaching this new group of missionaries all about Japan, about the language, about the culture, about the tradition, about the rules and the way they thought, the way they spoke, everything he knew. And so this new group of Jesuit missionaries inherited the mission that Francis originally started. Look, what they inherited was not something large. Francis didn't leave behind thousands of churches, and he didn't transform Japan overnight, but he left behind something far more important. He left behind trust, open doors, and planted seeds. And so the Jesuit missionaries set sail and journeyed to Japan, and they continued the mission fruitfully. As these new missionaries were in Japan, they continued to learn the Japanese language and culture even more deeply. They adapted carefully to Japanese society, just as Francis had begun doing in the past. They studied the customs, they built relationships with local rulers, and trained converts carefully in the Christian faith. And slowly, Christianity began to spread even further. Small Christian communities grew into larger ones, and the church mission in Japan was hugely successful. More missionaries arrived, churches were built, Bibles were passed out, Japanese converts themselves began sharing the faith with others. In some regions, even local lords became interested in Christianity. They studied it themselves, sought out Christianity, and converted all by themselves. These lords allowed missionaries to preach freely within their territories, and Christianity spread rapidly all across Japan. The faith was no longer just a foreign curiosity. Now it was becoming a part of Japanese society itself. Villages were converting, communities were growing, influential leaders were taking interest. For the first time, all was good, and the seeds of faith that Francis planted had grown into something that no one could have ever imagined. But as Christianity grew and spread, the leaders of Japan were watching all of this unfold, and they started to get anxious. They thought, who exactly were these foreign missionaries? Why were there so many people listening to them? Could Christianity potentially even divide loyalties? And if this new faith continues spreading, what would happen to the old order? This fear began quietly, but soon that fear would grow into suspicion, and that suspicion would eventually erupt into one of the most brutal persecutions in church history. In other parts of the world, European traders, explorers, and colonial powers had sometimes arrived alongside missionaries, and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the powerful ruler who had spent years fighting to unify Japan after generations of civil war, began to fear that the same thing could eventually happen to his country. To many Japanese leaders, Christianity no longer appeared to be just a religion. It seemed connected to powerful foreign nations that were expanding across Asia and beyond. But the missionaries themselves denied that they were agents of conquest. The Jesuits insisted that their mission was spiritual, not political. Their goal was conversion, not colonization. They arrived with no armies, no weapons, and no political authority at all. Many lived in poverty and learned the local language. They cared for the sick, they educated converts, and willingly risked their lives to simply just preach Christianity. And yet, the leaders still grew suspicious of them. Japanese leaders began debating the dangers of Christianity. They asked, was this new faith truly harmless, or could it become the doorway through which foreign powers would one day control Japan? Hideyoshi thought that he had worked too hard to unify the country to allow outside influence to threaten its stability. So, in 1587, Hideyoshi acted. He issued an edict ordering all Christian missionaries to leave Japan, and declared that Christianity was dangerous. So all these foreign priests were no longer welcome. But yet, the enforcement sort of remained inconsistent. Many missionaries still stayed behind secretly, and some local lords even protected them. So the Christian faith continued spreading quietly through parts of Japan. For a time, it still seemed like Christianity might survive. But then, something happened that changed everything. In 1596, a Spanish ship called the San Felipe was wrecked off the coast of Japan. As Japanese officials investigated the ship and questioned its crew, one of the sailors reportedly made a disastrous statement. According to historical accounts, he claimed that Spanish missionaries often prepared countries for conquest. He claimed that first came priests and then came the armies. Whether or not the statement was misunderstood, exaggerated, or fully true, it confirmed Hideyoshi's worst fear. Christianity was no longer viewed as merely a foreign religion. It was now seen as a possible threat to Japan itself, and so persecution began. Arrests were carried out against both foreign ministries and Japanese Christians alike. Jesuits, Franciscans, Japanese catechists, men, women, children, entire families were arrested. Their crime was simply their faith in Jesus Christ. But the Christians did not disappear. Despite their arrests, despite the threats, despite the growing persecution, the faith continued to spread, and the government became even more frustrated. So in 1597, Hideyoshi decided to make an example of the Christians. He took 26 believers, and instead of just arresting them, he condemned them to death. This group of believers included foreign missionaries, Japanese converts, Jesuits, Franciscans, and even young children. This sentence to death was meant to terrify the Christian population into abandoning the faith forever. Before the execution, the prisoners were publicly humiliated, parts of their left ears were cut off, and they were forced to march hundreds of kilometers across Japan, from Kyoto all the way to Nagasaki, all for the world to see. The journey began as a public spectacle. As they passed through towns and villages, crowds gathered and stared at them. The authorities wanted the people of Japan to see what happened if you identified as Christian. They wanted fear, shame, and humiliation. But something unexpected happened. These Christians, they were not afraid. They didn't feel humiliated. They didn't break at all. Even during the long march, many of them continued praying, continued preaching to the crowd, and encouraging one another. Some of them even sang hymns. Finally, on February 5th, 1957, the prisoners arrived at a hill overlooking Nagasaki. There, 26 crosses had been prepared. One by one, the Christians were bound to the crosses. Then, the soldiers executed them with spears. But what was incredible was that even in their final moments, many continued proclaiming their faith. They sang praises to God. Even the children remained faithful to the end. The authorities had hoped that these executions would crush Christianity in Japan, but instead, these martyrs became witnesses. Their courage stunned many who saw it, and the news of their deaths spread throughout Japan and made Christianity even stronger. Today, they are remembered as the 26 martyrs of Nagasaki, the first great martyrs of Christian Japan. But sadly, this was only the beginning. So the persecution continued, and after the death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, power eventually passed to the next leader, Tokugawa Ieyasu, the founder of the Tokugawa shogunates. Under the Tokugawa rulers, Japan entered a new era. The country slowly stabilized after generations of war. The government became even more organized, more centralized, and more determined to control every possible threat to its authority. And the growing Christian community was increasingly viewed as one of those great threats. By this time, there were as many as 300,000 Christians in Japan, and this really concerned the government. They had the same fears as the previous government. They saw the continued growth of Christianity despite the persecution as a failure of the previous government. So in 1614, the Tokugawa shogunate officially banned Christianity throughout Japan. To be a Christian was now a crime, punishable not by just arrest, but by torture and death. And so, government officials went around burning down churches, and Japanese Christians were ordered to renounce their faith or face execution. So the believers went into hiding, but the government was determined to exterminate Christianity from their country, so they devised a system, one that would expose hidden believers and break their resolve. It was called fumie. The fumie was a test of faith. It was a trap. Officials would place an image of our Lord Jesus Christ or the Blessed Virgin Mary on the ground and command people to step on it. To refuse to step was to reveal oneself as Christian and face death. To comply was to publicly deny Christ. Government officials carried these images with them wherever they went. They conducted surprise inspections in villages and in towns. Through the fumie, they sought out not only to identify Christians, but to force them to renounce their faith from their very hearts. This created a terrible trial. Some refused to step, but in doing so revealed they were Christian and were executed. Others unfortunately faltered out of fear, out of weakness, or out of love for their families. But yet, the gospel still remained. But he that shall deny me before men, I will also deny him before my Father who is in heaven. For the Christians in Japan, this was not an abstract teaching anymore. It was life or death. For those who refused to renounce the faith, the punishments were severe. Some were crucified, others were beheaded, some were burned alive, or drowned, or thrown into a boiling hot spring. It was brutal. Another method that became especially feared was something called anatsurushi, meaning the pit. Anatsurushi was a torture method where victims were hung upside down over a pit, bound tightly, where a small cut was done behind their ear to prolong their suffering. They would hang there for hours, for days, for weeks, until they eventually either died or broke. The government understood that the goal was not just death, it was apostasy, to make Christians publicly renounce their faith. The missionaries who secretly remained in Japan lived like fugitives. They hid in forests, mountains, in villages, or in isolated homes. Japanese Christians sheltered them at enormous risk to themselves and their families. For over 20 years, the church suffered greatly, and year after year after year, the shogunate tightened its control and the persecution just kept getting worse. In the region of Shimabara near Nagasaki, even many ordinary people were suffering terribly. Heavy taxes were crushing the population. Famine and poverty spread throughout the countryside. Local rulers demanded impossible payments from struggling peasants, and punishments for failure were often brutal. Many of the people living in Shimabara were Christian as well. Some came from families that had converted during the time of Francis Xavier, and as persecution intensified, their suffering only deepened. Eventually, this pressure became too much. So in 1637, thousands of peasants, farmers, ronin, and persecuted Christians rose up in rebellion against the local authorities. This uprising became known as the Shimabara Rebellion. These rebels went to war with the government, and many of these rebels carried Christian banners and crosses. The rebels eventually gathered at Hara Castle, where they made their final stand against the shogunate. Inside the fortress were men, women, children, and elderly. Many were starving, many were already exhausted and wounded, but they refused to surrender. The Tokugawa government responded with overwhelming force. An enormous army surrounded the castle, and for months the siege continued. Cannons bombarded the fortress, food supplies ran out, and starvation spread amongst the defenders. And finally, in 1638, the castle fell. And what followed was a massacre, one of the worst internal massacres in Japanese history. An estimated 37,000 civilians were killed. The rebellion was crushed completely. To the rulers of Japan, the lesson of this massacre seemed clear. That was it for Christianity. The government resolved to eliminate Christianity once and for all. So the government made one of the most dramatic decisions in Japanese history. They made a policy known as sakoku, meaning closed country. This sealed Japan off from much of the outside world. Foreign ships were now banned from entering Japan, and Japanese citizens were largely prohibited from ever leaving the country. And to get rid of Christianity once and for all, the government increased persecution efforts even further. They dedicated a huge amount of resources to hunting down Christians. Communities were forced to participate in Fumiya ceremonies regularly. Hidden Christians were hunted relentlessly, and this continued for more than 200 years. Christianity seemed to disappear, and persecution continued. The Japanese government believed they had won. For more than 200 years, it seemed like Christianity was eradicated from Japan. But in the shadows, in the silence, the miracle of faith endured. The Japanese Christians went into complete hiding. Those that remained and survived the horrific persecution they endured. They hid in extremely remote villages, isolated islands, and mountain communities. Even in isolation, they were careful. Small groups of believers continued practicing Christianity in secret. And what makes their story so extraordinary is that they survived completely cut off from the church. No, there were no more priests, no more Bibles. There were no seminaries, no churches, and no public demonstrations of faith. For generations, these Japanese Christians had to preserve the faith entirely on their own, always aware that discovery meant death. Families quietly passed down prayers, teachings, and traditions from one generation to the next. Everything was done in absolute secrecy. Every single act carried danger. Any moment, government officials could arrive to investigate suspected Christians. Over the centuries, the hidden Christians developed remarkable ways of concealing their faith. Statues of the Virgin Mary were made to resemble Buddhist figures like Kannon, the goddess of mercy. Nothing was written down. Prayers were memorized because anything written would be discovered during searches. These prayers survived in albeit altered forms, but they survived for centuries. These Japanese Christians did not abandon Christ. This is what makes the story of Japan so unique. For centuries, the church in Japan was silent, unknown to the world, but not unknown to God. For more than 200 years, these hidden Christians in Japan had waited. Generations had lived and died in secrecy. Families had risked everything to preserve the faith. And all the while they wondered, will the church ever return? Time went by, new rulers came and went, and Japan began slowly reopening to the outside world. It was now the 1800s, and after centuries of isolation, foreign ships once again appeared along the Japanese coast. Trade resumed with Western nations, and eventually foreign missionaries were cautiously allowed to return. For the first time in hundreds of years, Christian priests stood once again on Japanese soil. One of those missionaries was a French priest named Father Bernard Petitjean of the Paris Foreign Mission Society. And so, in 1865, near Nagasaki, a small church was built for foreign residents. It was called the Ora Church. To Father Bernard, it probably seemed like a small and ordinary beginning, but he had no idea that one of the most extraordinary moments in Christian history was about to unfold. Not long after the church opened, a small group of Japanese villagers quietly approached him. They were cautious and careful not to attract attention. Then one of the women stepped forward and asked Father Bernard a question that would leave him stunned. She asked, "Where is the statue of Santa Maria?" Father Bernard was shocked. These villagers somehow knew about the Virgin Mary. More of the villagers stepped forward and they continued to ask him more questions. They asked him, do you honor the Virgin Mary? Are you sent by the Pope in Rome? Do your priests remain unmarried? Father Bernard continued to speak with these villagers, and as the conversation continued, the truth slowly emerged. These were the descendants of the families who survived persecution. Their ancestors had taught them to look for signs, for proof that the church had truly returned. And now standing before them was a real Catholic priest for the first time in over 200 years. Father Bernard could hardly believe it. Everyone thought that Christianity in Japan had died, but it didn't. It had survived underground that entire time. After this, news of the hidden Christians had spread and more hidden Christians began emerging. What was incredible was that thousands revealed themselves. Entire communities had secretly preserved the faith generation after generation. Even Pope Pius IX would later describe it as an absolute miracle. Against all odds, through persecution, through isolation, through fear, through centuries without priests or churches, the faith had endured. The seeds planted long ago had never truly died. They had remained hidden beneath the surface of Japan, waiting for the day that they could finally emerge into the light once again. And it did. The faith prevailed. And that, my dear friends, is the story of Christianity in Japan. A story of missionaries crossing oceans into unknown lands. A story of courage, suffering, persecution, and faith. A story that should have ended many times, and yet somehow it never did. Empires can rise and fall, governments can change, persecutions come and go, but the gospel continues moving throughout history. I know that the church still suffers today, and sometimes it feels so hopeless, but I think that this story reminds us that the truth will always prevail. Now, out of a population of over 125 million people, Christians make up less than 1% in Japan, and Catholics only a fraction of that. But my dear brothers and sisters, the mission still continues, for Christ has not abandoned Japan, and the seeds that were planted so long ago, watered by the blood of martyrs, they still wait to bear more fruit.